Out of all the entries in the collection of texts that we know as the Apostolic Fathers, the Epistle to Diognetus is a bit conspicuous. The epistle is not connected with a famous church leader, like many of the other Apostolic Fathers. We don't know anything concrete about its author or even about Diognetus, the person to whom the letter was written. The letter's specifically apologetic purpose, that is, defending or explaining the Christian faith to an outsider, makes it stand out. But despite its oddities, the Epistle to Diognetus gives us an important look into how Christians in the 2nd century thought of themselves, and how they sought to explain their faith and practices to people outside the Christian community. One of the challenging aspects of the Epistle to Diognetus is that no ancient copies of the letter have survived. The most recent manuscript was destroyed by a fire in 1870. We only know of the epistle through transcriptions of medieval-era manuscripts. However, despite the difficulties that go along with the lack of a manuscript tradition, the style and content of the text that we have suggests that the epistle was written during the second half of the 2nd century, sometime after 150 CE. The 2nd century was a period of transition for Christians in the Roman Empire. Christians had begun to define themselves and their communities as distinct from the Jewish communities that Jewish Christians of previous decades had belonged to. The concern for Christian identity apart from Jewish identity is on full display in the epistle. The 2nd century also brought to the surface the issue of persecution. The cruelty of Nero against the Christians of the city of Rome itself had long since passed. The more widespread, state-driven persecutions of Decius would not come about until the middle of the 3rd century. Nevertheless, 2nd century Christians were still at risk from persecution and maltreatment from their neighbors. Outsiders frequently regarded Christian communities with suspicion and contempt. Although lethal persecution was not widespread, Christians still had to reckon with more mundane, everyday opposition to their way of life. Like much Christian literature from the 2nd century, the Epistle to Diognetus shows concern for an appropriate response to a society that was often hostile towards Christian communities. The epistle is addressed to someone named Diognetus, whose name can be translated as son of Zeus in Greek. This person is apparently intrigued by the beliefs and practices of the Christian community. The epistle's author writes not only to describe how Christians live and what they believe, but also to explain why Christians do not follow either the religious practices of the Greeks and Romans or those of the Jewish communities within the Roman Empire. The author's argument against Greek and Roman religion centers on the nature of idols themselves. The author asks, "These things which are now being worshipped by you, would it not be possible for them to be made by human hands? Are they not all mute, blind, inanimate?" So, the author reasons, if the Greek and Roman gods are simply inanimate statues, they cannot possibly be worth worshipping. Furthermore, the author argues that anti-Christian sentiment cannot be justified on the basis of non-worship of the Greek and Roman pantheon, since Christians understandably conclude that these idols are not true gods. Next, the author argues against the Jewish way of worshiping God. The author admits that, unlike the Greeks and Romans, the Jewish people worship the one true God. However, in the author's mind, God has no need of things such as sacrifices. Therefore, Jewish worship via sacrifice does not honor God. The author regards futile worship of the true God to be just as pointless as honoring inanimate idols. The letter continues by engaging in a rather dismissive critique of Jewish adherence to the law of Moses. The Jewish people are described as ridiculous, silly, and prideful because of their supposed preoccupation with dietary laws, their practice of circumcision, their celebration of feasts, and their observance of the Sabbath. The author asks, who would consider this an example of godliness and not of so much more foolishness? The author plays upon decidedly negative stereotypes about Jewish people and their practices. There seems to be an expectation that Diognetus himself shares in these opinions. After distancing the religious practice of Christians from that of their non-Christian neighbors, the author goes on to describe Christians as being somewhat out of place in the world. Christians, by virtue of their way of life, are distinct from the people around them. The author uses the metaphor of the soul and the body, noting that what the soul is in the body, this is what the Christians are in the world. The soul dwells in the body but is not of the body, and Christians dwell in the world but are not of the world. Nevertheless, despite the virtues of the Christians, they are described as being persecuted and maltreated by their neighbors. This, according to the letter writer, is a sign of God's coming judgment. The letter proceeds to describe the mercy of God in bestowing salvation upon ungodly human beings. The letter writer urges Diognetus to respond positively to this mercy and become an imitator of God, so that he might understand both the mystery of the Christian religion and the perseverance of Christians amid opposition. Here in the final appeal, the apologetic thrust lies not so much in the religious argumentation featured earlier on in the letter. Rather, the author emphasizes the lived example of the Christians themselves and Diognetus' own potential experience and knowledge of God. The Epistle to Diognetus concludes with a liturgical section that is thought to be a later addition to the original letter. Here, the knowledge of God spoken of in the original letter is connected to God's revelation through the biblical story. From the Garden of Eden to the law and prophets of Israel to the apostles of the Christian church, true knowledge and love of God is that which brings life and salvation to humanity. The Epistle to Diognetus gives us a glimpse into how Christians in the 2nd century viewed themselves and their place in the world. In the course of answering Diognetus' curiosity about the Christian religion, this letter presents a Christianity that is in but not of the world. Distinct from Greeks and Romans and separate from the Jewish people, the letter's author describes Christians as those who suffer at the hands of their neighbors. Nevertheless, despite hardship, these same Christians are also described as the recipients of God's mercy. The letter is a persuasive invitation for Diognetus to join the Christian community so that he might become an imitator of God's goodness. Whether Diognetus ever became a Christian himself, we do not know. Yet, this letter remains an important witness to early Christian theological apologetics in the midst of a changing and hostile world. This has been Andrew H. Waller. Thanks for listening.